Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's Allison here, and I wanted to do a follow up. I know it's been a few weeks on this book by Michael Ende, Momo. Um, you may be able to tell that I'm back on the McDowell sofa. And so essentially, Seattle and I uh, did not make a partnership. And so I'm back in Philadelphia and looking for the next thing, plan B or plan C or whatever it is. So I'm back for the time being. I'm clearing out my house. If my hair looks really big, I'm trying to be frugal so I don't have the air on. It's been super hot the last few days and there's like a blessed rain falling. So I have some mapping to do that I promised Jason and Brandy. But I've been consumed by cleaning out my house and possibly getting ready to sell it in the spring. Hopefully I'll get a job before then and I won't have to sell my house and I can stay here and keep sitting on the McDowell sofa and reading to you all. So if you know of anybody who has jobs in Philadelphia looking for a feisty researcher and project manager, let me know. Send them my way. I have a LinkedIn now. You can find me, Allison McDowell, on LinkedIn. I have dandelions on my background. So, anyway, none of us are out of the machine. We're all kind of in the machine. So welcome back. And if you missed the first installment, you can find it on the channel. And this book, oh gosh, I'm trying to think. Let me just see when it was written. The print is kind of small. I'm looking, 1973. So I would have been a little kid at the time that it came out. And if you missed the beginning, essentially it is, it's about a little girl and she's, the orphan girl of the fairy tales. And she lives in an amphitheater in a little town. And initially the townspeople try to get her to go to some sort of orphanage, but she's like, no, I ran away from the orphanage. So they let her live in the amphitheater and they build her like a little tiny house. And in the amphitheater, she brings all of the kids come in and they play all of these imaginative games. And Momo is known for being a good listener. And then she has two special friends, Beppo, the street sweeper, and Guido, the guide. And the street sweeper is an older man and the guide is a young man. And at the end of the last installment, these little gray men show up. And it turns out the little gray men are connected to this time banking thing. And I've been looking into all these community currencies and time banks and putting them on blockchain. So it's quite interesting. And also the little gray men are sort of, technocracy, though, that they were always wearing the gray suits. I don't know that he was thinking technocracy, but the technocrats were gray, drove around in gray cars and wore gray suits. So we're going to start the next installment, which is chapter 5, and it's called Tall Stories. Okay. As time went by, Momo became absolutely indispensable to Guido. That's her friend, the guide. He developed as deep an affection for the ragged little girl as any footloose, fancy-free young man could have felt for any fellow creature. Making up stories was his ruling passion, as we have already said, and it was in this very respect that he underwent a change of which he himself was fully aware. In the old days, not all of his stories had turned out well. Either he ran short of ideas and he was forced to repeat himself, or he borrowed from some movie he'd seen or some newspaper article he'd read. His stories had plodded along, so to speak, but Momo's friendship had suddenly lent them wings. Most of all, it was when Momo sat listening to him that his imagination blossomed like a meadow in springtime. Children and grown-ups flocked to hear him. He could now tell stories in episodes spanning days or even weeks, and he never ran out of ideas. He listened to himself as enthralled as his audience, never knowing where his imagination would lead him. The next time some tourists visited the amphitheater, Momo was sitting on one of the steps nearby, and he began as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you all know, the Empress Harmonica waged countless wars in defense of her realm, which was under constant attack by the goats and the hens. Having subdued these barbarian tribes for the umpteenth time, she was so infuriated by their endless troublemaking that she threatened to exterminate them once and for all, unless their king, Raucus II, made amends by sending her his goldfish. At that period, ladies and gentlemen, goldfish were still unknown in these parts, but Empress Harmonica had heard from a traveler that King Raucus owned a small fish which, when fully grown, would turn into solid gold. And the Empress was determined to get her hands on this rare specimen. King Raucus laughed up his sleeve at this. He hid the real goldfish under his bed and sent the Empress a young whale in a bejeweled soup tureen. The Empress, who had imagined goldfish to be smaller, was rather surprised at the creature's size. Never mind, she told herself, the bigger the better. The bigger now, the more gold later on. There wasn't a hint of gold about the fish, not even a glimmer, which worried her until King Raucus's envoy explained it wouldn't turn gold until it had stopped growing, and consequently its growth should not be obstructed in any way. Empress Harmonica pronounced herself satisfied with this explanation. The young fish grew bigger every day, consuming vast quantities of food. But Empress Harmonica was a wealthy woman, and it was given as much food as it could put away, so it grew big and fat. Before long, the soup tureen became too small for it. The bigger the better, said the Empress, and had it transferred to her bathtub. And very soon it wouldn't fit in her bathtub either, so it was installed in the imperial swimming pool. Transferring it to the pool was no mean feat because it now weighed as much as an ox. And when one of the slaves carrying it lost his footing, the Empress promptly had the wretched man thrown to the lions, for the fish was now the apple of her eye. Harmonica spent many hours each day sitting beside the swimming pool, watching the creature grow. And all she could think of was the gold that it would make, because I'm sure you know she had a very luxurious life and could never have enough gold to meet her needs. The bigger the better, she kept repeating herself. These words were proclaimed a national motto and inscribed in letters of bronze on every public building. When even the imperial swimming pool became too cramped, as it eventually did, Harmonica built the edifice whose ruins you see before you, ladies and gentlemen. It was a huge, round aquarium filled to the brim with water, and here the whale could at last stretch out in comfort. And from now on, the Empress sat watching the great fish day and night, watching and waiting for the moment when it would turn into gold. She no longer trusted a soul, not even her slaves or relations, and dreaded that the fish might be stolen from her. So here she sat, wasting away with fear and worry, never closing her eyes, forever watching the fish as it blithely splashed around without the least intention of turning into gold. Harmonica neglected her affairs of state more and more, which was just what the Goatskin Head had been waiting for. Led by King Raucus, they launched one final invasion and conquered the country in no time. They never encountered a single enemy soldier, and the common folk didn't care one way or the other who ruled them. And when Empress Harmonica finally heard what had happened, she uttered the well-known words, "Alas, if only I'd," and the rest of the sentence is lost in the mists of time, unfortunately. All we know for sure is that she threw herself into this very aquarium and perished alongside the creature that had blighted her hopes. King Raucus celebrated his victory by ordering the whale to be slaughtered, and the entire population feasted on grilled whale steak for a week. Which only goes to show, ladies and gentlemen, how unwise it is to believe all you're told. And that concluded Guido's lecture, and most of his listeners were profoundly impressed and surveyed the ruined amphitheater with awe. Only one of them was skeptical enough to strike a note of doubt. "When is all of this supposed to have happened?" he asked. "I need hardly remind you," said Guido, who was never at a loss for words, "that Empress Harmonica was a contemporary of the celebrated philosopher Gnosius the Elder." Understandably reluctant to admit his total ignorance of the celebrated philosopher Gnosius the Elder, and when he had lived, the skeptic merely nodded and said, "Ah, yes, of course." And all of the other tourists were thoroughly satisfied. Their visit had been worthwhile, they declared. No guide had ever presented them with such a graphic and interesting account of ancient times. And when Guido modestly held out his peaked cap, they showed themselves correspondingly generous, and even the skeptic dropped a few coins in. Guido, incidentally, had never told the same story twice since Momo's arrival on the scene. He would have found that far too boring. When Momo was in the audience, a floodgate seemed to open up inside of him, releasing a torrent of new ideas that bubbled forth without his ever having to think twice. On the contrary, he often had to restrain himself from going too far, as he did the day his services were enlisted by two elderly American ladies whose blood he curdled with the following tale. It is, of course, common knowledge, even in your own fair, freedom loving land, dear ladies, that the cruel tyrant Maxentius Communis, nicknamed the Red, resolved to mold the world to fit his own ideas. Try as he might, however, he found that people refused to change their ways and remained much the same as they always had been. Towards the end of his life, Maxentius Communis went mad. The ancient world had no psychiatrist capable of curing such mental disorders, as I'm sure you know, so the tyrant continued to rave unchecked. He eventually took it into his head to leave the existing world to its own devices and create a brand new world of his own. He therefore decreed the construction of a globe exactly the same size as the old one, complete with perfect replicas of everything in it, every building and tree, every mountain, river, and sea. The entire population of the earth was compelled on pain of death to assist in this vast project. And I guess that seems like the digital twinning, right? Microsoft's planetary computer. Yep, a twin of the world. And everyone compelled to build it. First, they built the base on which the huge new globe would rest, and then the remains of that base, dear ladies, are what you now see before you. And then they started to construct the globe itself, a gigantic sphere as big as the earth, and once this sphere had been completed, it was furnished with perfect copies of everything on the earth. The sphere used up vast quantities of building materials, of course, and these could be taken only from the earth itself, and so the earth got smaller and smaller, while the sphere got bigger and bigger. And by the time the new world was finished, every last little scrap of the old world had been carried away. What was more, the whole of mankind had naturally been obliged to move to the new world because the old one was all used up. And when it dawned on Maxentius Communis that besides all his efforts, everything was just as it had been, he buried his head in his toga and tottered off. Where to, no one knows. So you see, ladies, this crater-like depression in the ruins before you used to be the dividing line between the old world and the new. In other words, you must picture everything upside down. The American dowagers turned pale, and one of them said in a quavering voice, But what became of Maxentius Communis's world? Why, you're standing on it right now, Guido told her. Our world, ladies, is his. The two old things let out a squawk of terror and took to their heels, and this time Guido held out his cap in vain. Guido's favorite pastime, though, was telling stories to Momo on her own, with no one else around. They were fairy tales mostly because Momo liked those best, and they were about Momo and Guido themselves. And being intended for just the two of them, they sounded quite different from any other stories Guido told. One fine, warm evening, the pair of them were sitting quietly side by side on the topmost tier of the stone steps. And the first stars were already twinkling in the sky, and a big silvery moon was climbing above the dark silhouettes of the pine trees. Will you tell me a story? Momo asked softly. All right, said Guido. What about? Best of all, I like it to be about us, Momo said. And Guido thought a while, and then he said, Well, what shall we call it? How about the tale of the magic mirror? Guido nodded thoughtfully. Sounds promising, he said. Let's see how it turns out. And he put his arm around Momo and began. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess named Momo who dressed in silk and satin and lived high above the world on a snow-clad mountaintop in a palace built of stained glass. And she had everything her heart could desire, nothing but the choicest food and wine ever passed her lips. She reclined on silken cushions and sat on ivory chairs. She had everything, I say, but she was all alone. All the people and things around her, her footmen and ladies in waiting, her dogs and cats and birds, and even her flowers, were merely reflections. The fact was, Princess Momo had a magic mirror, big and round and made of the finest silver, and every day and every night she used to send it out into the world, and the big round mirror soared over the land, sea, town, and countryside. People who saw it weren't a bit surprised. All they ever said was, there's the moon. And while every time the magic mirror came back to the princess, it would empty out the reflections it had collected on its travels, beautiful and ugly, interesting and dull, and as the case may be, the princess picked out the one she liked best, and the others she simply threw into a stream, and quicker than the speed of thought, these discarded reflections sped back to their owners along the waterways of the earth. And that is why you'll find your own reflection looking at you whenever you bend over a stream or a pool of water. I forgot to mention that Princess Momo was immortal. Why? Because she'd never seen her own reflection in the magic mirror, and anyone who saw his own reflection in it became mortal at once. And being well aware of this, Princess Momo took care not to do so. She had always been quite content to live and play with her many other reflections. One day, however, the magic mirror brought her a reflection that appealed to her more than any other, and it was a reflection of a young prince. As soon as she saw it, she longed to meet him face to face. How was she to go about it, though? She didn't know where he lived or who he was. She didn't even know his name. For want of a better idea, she decided to look into the magic mirror after all, thinking it might carry her own reflection to the prince. There was a chance that he might be looking up at the sky when the mirror floated past and would see her in it. And perhaps he would follow the mirror back to the palace and find her there. So she gazed into the mirror long and hard and sent it off around the world with her reflection. By doing so, of course, she lost her immortality. And before saying what happened to her next, I must tell you something about the prince. His name was Girolamo, and he ruled a great kingdom of his own creation. This kingdom was situated neither in the present nor the past, but always one day ahead in the future, which was why it was called Futuria. And everyone who dwelt there loved and admired the prince. "Your Royal Highness," the prince's advisors told him one day, "it is time you got married." The prince had no objection, so Futuria's loveliest young ladies were brought to the palace for him to choose from. And they all made themselves look as beautiful as possible because each of them naturally wanted his choice to fall on her. Among them, however, was a wicked fairy who had managed to sneak into the palace. The blood that ran in her veins was green and cold, not red and warm, but nobody noticed this because she had painted her face so skillfully. And when the Prince of Futuria entered the great golden throne room, she quickly muttered such a potent spell that poor Girolamo had eyes for no one but her. And he found her so incomparably beautiful that he asked her on the spot if she would be his wife. "With pleasure," hissed the wicked fairy, "but only on one condition." "Name it," the prince said promptly, without a second thought. "Very well," said the wicked fairy, and she smiled so sweetly that the poor prince's head swam. "For 1 whole year, you must never look up at the moon in the sky, and if you do, you will instantly lose all your royal possessions, and you will forget who you really are, and you will find yourself transported to the land of Presentia, where you will lead the life of a poor unknown wretch. Do you accept my terms?" "Oh, if that's all you ask," cried Prince Girolamo, "what could be easier?" Meanwhile, Princess Momo had been waiting in vain for the prince to appear, so she resolved to venture out into the world and look for him. And she let all of her reflections go, and leaving her stained glass palace behind, set off down the snow-clad mountainside in her dainty little slippers. And she roamed the world until she came to Presentia, by which time her slippers were worn out and she had to go barefoot. But the magic mirror bearing her reflection continued to soar overhead. And one night, while Princess Girolamo was sitting on the roof of his golden palace, playing checkers with the fairy, whose blood was cold and green, he felt a little drop of moisture on his hand. "Ah," said the green-blooded fairy, "it's starting to rain." "It can't be," said the prince. "There isn't a cloud in the sky." And he looked up, straight into the big silver mirror soaring overhead, and saw from Princess Momo's reflection that she was weeping and that one of her tears had fallen on his hand. And at that instant, he realized that the fairy had tricked him and that she wasn't beautiful at all and had cold green blood in her veins. His true love, he realized, was Princess Momo. "You've broken your promise," snapped the green-blooded fairy, scowling so hideously that she looked like a snake, "and now you must pay the price." And then, while Prince Girolamo sat there as though paralyzed, she reached inside him and with her long green fingers tied a knot in his heart. And instantly forgetting that he was the Prince of Futuria, he slunk out of the palace like a thief in the night and wandered far and wide till he came to Presentia, where he took the name Guido and lived a life of poverty and obscurity. All he'd brought with him was Princess Momo's reflection from the magic mirror, which was blank from then on. And by now, Princess Momo had abandoned the ragged remains of her silk and satin gown, and she wore a patchwork dress and a man's cast off jacket far too big for her, and she was living in an ancient ruin. And when the two of them met there one fine day, Princess Momo failed to recognize poor, good for nothing Guido as the Prince of Futuria. And Guido didn't recognize her either because she no longer looked like a princess, but they became companions in misfortune and a source of consolation to each other. And one evening, when the magic mirror, now blank, was floating across the sky, Guido took out Momo's reflection and showed it to her. Crumpled and faded though it was, the princess immediately recognized it as her own, the one she'd sent soaring around the world. And then, as she peered more closely at the poor wretch beside her, she saw that he was her long sought prince, for whose sake she had renounced her immortality. She told him the whole story, but Guido sadly shook his head. "Your words mean nothing to me," he said. "There's a knot in my heart, and it stops me remembering." And so Princess Momo laid her hand on his breast and untied the knot in his heart with ease. And Princess Girolamo suddenly remembered who he was and where he came from, and he took Princess Momo by the hand and led her far, far away to the distant land of Futuria. And they both sat silent for a while when Guido had finished, and then Momo asked, "Did they ever get married?" "I think so," said Guido. "Later on." "And are they dead now?" "No," Guido said firmly. "I happens to know for a fact. The magic mirror only made you mortal if you looked into it on your own. If two people looked into it together, it made them immortal again, and that's what those two people did." And the big silver moon floated high above the dark pine trees, bathing the ruins' ancient stonework in its mysterious light. And Momo and Guido sat there side by side, gazing up at it for a long, long time, and feeling quite certain that if only for the space of that enchanted moment, the pair of them were immortal. Oh, so now we're in part 2, The Men in Gray. The time bankers. Okay, life holds one great but quite commonplace mystery. Though shared by each of us and known to all, it seldom rates a second thought. That mystery, which most of us take for granted and never think twice about, is time. Calendars and clocks exist to measure time, but that signifies little because we all know that an hour can seem an eternity or pass in a flash according to how we spend it. Time is life itself, and life resides in the human heart. The men in gray knew this better than anyone. And nobody knew the value of an hour or a minute or even of a single second as well as they. They were experts on time, just as leeches are experts on blood, and they acted accordingly. They had designs on people's time, long-term and well-laid plans of their own. And what mattered most to them was that no one should become aware of their activities. They had surreptitiously installed themselves in the city, and now step by step, day by day, they were secretly invading its inhabitants' lives and taking them over. They knew the identity of every person likely to further their plans long before that person had any inkling of it. They waited for the ideal moment to entrap him, and they saw to it that the ideal moment came. One such person was Mr. Figaro, the barber. Though not by any means a high-class hairdresser, he was well respected in the neighborhood. Neither rich nor poor, he owned a small barber shop in the center of town and employed an apprentice. And one day, Mr. Figaro was standing at the door of his shop waiting for customers. It was the apprentice's day off, and so he was alone. Raindrops were spattering the pavement, and the sky was bleak and dreary as Mr. Figaro's mood. "Life is passing me by," he told himself, "and what am I getting out of it? Wielding a pair of scissors, chatting to customers, lathering their faces. Is that the most I can expect? When I'm dead, it'll be as if I never existed." In fact, Mr. Figaro had no objection at all to chatting. He liked to air his opinions and hear what his customers thought of them. He had no objection to wielding a pair of scissors or lathering faces either. He genuinely enjoyed his work and knew he did it well. Few barbers could have shaved the underside of a man's chin as smoothly against the lie of the stubble, but there were times when none of this seemed to matter. "I am an utter failure," thought Mr. Figaro. "I mean, What do I amount to? A small-time barber, that is all. If only I could lead the right kind of life, I would be a different person altogether. Exactly what form the right kind of life should take, Mr. Figaro wasn't sure. He vaguely pictured it as distinguished and affluent existence, such as he was always reading about in the glossy magazines. The trouble is, he thought sourly, my work leaves me no time for that sort of thing, and you need time for the right kind of life. You've got to be free, and I'm a lifelong prisoner of scissors, lather, and chit chat. And at the moment, a smart gray limousine pulled up right outside Mr. Figaro's barber shop. A gray suited man got out and walked in, and he deposited his gray briefcase on the ledge in front of the mirror, hung his gray bowler on the hat rack, sat down in the barber's chair, and produced a gray notebook from his breast pocket and started leafing through it, puffing meanwhile at a small gray cigar. Mr. Figaro shut the street door because he suddenly found it strangely chilly in his little shop. "What's it to be?" he asked. "Shave or a haircut?" Even as he spoke, he cursed himself for being so tactless. The stranger was bald as an egg. The man in gray didn't smile. "Neither," he replied in a particularly flat and expressionless voice, a gray voice, so to speak. "I'm from the Time Saving Bank. Permit me to introduce myself, agent number XYQ /384/B. We hear that you wish to open an account with us." "Well, that's news to me," said Mr. Figaro. "To be honest, I didn't even know such a bank existed." "Well, you know now," said the agent crisply, and he consulted his little gray notebook. "Your name is Figaro, isn't it?" "Correct," said Mr. Figaro. "That's me." "Well, then I've come to the right address," said the man in gray, shutting his notebook with a snap. "You're on our list of applicants." "How come?" asked Mr. Figaro, who was still at a loss. "Well, it's like this, my dear sir," said the man in gray. "You're wasting your life cutting hair, lathering faces, and swapping idle chit-chat. And when you're dead, it'll be as if you'd never existed. If you had only the time to lead the right kind of life, you would be quite a different person. Time is all you need then, right?" "Well, that's just what I was thinking a minute ago," mumbled Mr. Figaro, and he shivered because it was getting colder and colder in spite of the door being shut. "You see," said the man in gray, puffing contentedly at his small cigar, "you need more time. But how are you going to find it? By saving it, of course. You, Mr. Figaro, are wasting time in a totally irresponsible way. Now let me prove that to you by simple arithmetic. There are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. Are you with me so far?" "Well, of course," said Mr. Figaro. Agent number XYQ /384/B produced a piece of gray chalk and scrawled some figures on the mirror. 60 times 60 is 3,600, which makes 3,600 seconds in an hour. And then there are 24 hours in a day, so multiply 3,600 by 24 to find the number of seconds in a day, and you arrive at a figure of 86,400. And then there are 365 days in a year, as you know, which makes 31,536,000 seconds in a year, or 315,360,000 seconds in a year, in 10 years. How long do you reckon you'll live, Mr. Figaro?" "Well," stammered Mr. Figaro, thoroughly disconcerted by now, I hope to live to 70 or 80, God willing." "Very well," pursued the man in gray. "So let's call it 70 just to be on the safe side. Multiply 315,360,000 by 7, and you set a grand total of 2,207,520,000 seconds." And he chalked this figure up on the mirror in outsized numbers. 2,207,520,000, and underlined it several times. "That, Mr. Figaro, is the extent of the capital at your disposal." Mr. Figaro gulped, and he wiped his brow, feeling quite dizzy. He'd never realized how rich he was. "Yes," said the agent, nodding and puffing on his small gray cigar. "It is an impressive figure, isn't it? But let us continue. Now, how old are you now, Mr. Figaro?" 42, the barber mumbled, and he suddenly felt guilty as if he'd committed a fraud of some kind. "And how long do you sleep at night on average?" "Oh, around 8 hours," Mr. Figaro admitted. The agent did some lightning calculations, and the squeak of his chalk as it raced across the mirror set Mr. Figaro's teeth on edge. 42 years at 8 hours a night makes 441,504,000 seconds, and we'll have to write all of that off, I'm afraid. And how much of the day do you devote to work, Mr. Figaro? Well, another 8 hours or so, Figaro said apologetically. Well, then we'll have to write off that same amount again. The agent pursued relentlessly, and you have to spend a certain proportion of the day eating. So how many hours would you say count as meals? I don't exactly know, Mr. Figaro said nervously. I don't know, 2 hours maybe? That sounds like it's on the low side to me, said the agent, but assuming it's correct, we get a figure of 110,376,000 seconds in 42 years. And to continue, you live alone with your elderly mother, as we know, and you spend a good hour with the old woman every day. And that's to say, you sit and talk to her, although she's so deaf she can scarcely hear a word. And that counts as more time wasted, 55,188,000 seconds to be precise. And you also keep a budgegar, a needless extravagance who demands on your time amounts to 15 minutes a day, or 13,797,000 seconds in 42 years. But Mr. Figaro broke in imploringly. Don't interrupt, snapped the agent, his chalk racing faster and faster across the mirror. Your mother's arithmetic your mother's arthritic. Your mother's arthritic as well as deaf, so you have to do more of the housework, and you go shopping and clean shoes and perform other chores of a similar nature. So how much time does that consume? Oh, an hour maybe, but so you've already squandered another 55,188,000 seconds, Mr. Figaro. And we also know that you go to the cinema once a week and sing with a social club once a week and go drinking twice a week and spend the rest of your evenings reading and gossiping with friends. And in short, you devote some 3 hours a day to useless pastimes that have lost you another 165,564,000 seconds. The agent broke off. What is the matter, Mr. Figaro? Aren't you feeling well? No, said the barber. Yes. Please excuse me. I'm almost through, said the agent. First, though, we must touch on a rather personal aspect of your life, your little secret, if you know what I mean. And Mr. Figaro was so cold that his teeth had started to chatter. So you know about that too, he muttered feebly. I didn't think anyone knew except for me and Miss Daria. There's no room for secrets in the world of today, the inquisitor broke in. That's a useful quote there. No secrets today in the world of ubiquitous surveillance and pervasive computing. Look at the matter rationally and realistically, Mr. Figaro, and ask me one thing. Do you plan to marry Miss Daria? No, I couldn't do that. Quite so, said the man in gray. Being paralyzed from the waist down, she'll have to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair, and yet you visit her every day for half an hour and take her flowers. Why? Well, she's always so pleased to see me, Mr. Figaro replied, close to tears. But looked at objectively from your own point of view, said the agent, it is time wasted, 27,594,000 seconds of it to date. And furthermore, if we allow for your habit of sitting at the window for a quarter of an hour every night, musing on the day's events, we have to write off yet another 13,797,000 seconds. And very well, let's see how much that makes in all. And he drew a line under a long column of figures and added them up with the rapidity of a computer. And the sum on the mirror now looks something like this. And I'll just show you because that's too many numbers to read. They have tally marks for sleep, work, meals, mother, budgerigar, I don't know what that is, shopping, friends, Miss Daria, daydreaming, grand total, lots of seconds. And that figure, said the man in gray, rapping the mirror with his chalk so sharply, it sounded like a burst of machine gun fire, and that figure represents the time you've wasted up to now. What do you say to that, Mr. Figaro? Mr. Figaro said nothing. He slumped into a chair in the corner of the shop and mopped his brow with a handkerchief, sweating hard despite the icy atmosphere. The man in gray nodded gravely. Yes, you are quite right, my dear sir. You have used up more than half of your original capital. And now let's see how much of that leaves of your 42 years. 1 year is 31,536,000 seconds, and that multiplied by 42 comes to 1,324,512,000 seconds. And beneath the previous total, he wrote, total time available, total time lost to date, balance 0. And then he pocketed his chalk and waited for the sight of all the zeros to take effect, which they did. And so that's all my life amounts to, thought Mr. Figaro. absolutely shattered. He was so impressed by the elaborate sum, which had come out perfectly, that he was ready to accept whatever advice the stranger had to offer. It was one of the tricks the men in gray used to dupe prospective customers. Agent number XYQ/384/B broke the silence. Can you really afford to go on like this? He said blandly. Wouldn't you prefer to start saving right away, Mr. Figaro? Mr. Figaro nodded mutely, blue-lipped with cold. For example, came the agent's gray voice in his ear, if you'd started saving even 1 hour a day 20 years ago, you'd now have a credit balance of 26,280,000 seconds. 2 hours a day would have saved you twice that amount, of course, or 52,560,000. And I ask you, Mr. Figaro, what are 2 measly little hours in comparison with a sum of that magnitude? Nothing, cried Mr. Figaro, a mere flea bite. I'm glad you agree, the agent said smoothly. And if we calculate how much you could have saved that way after another 20 years, we arrive at the handsome figure of 105,120,000 seconds. And the whole of that capital, Mr. Figaro, would have been freely available to you at the age of 62. Fantastic, stammered Mr. Figaro, wide-eyed with awe. But that's not all, the agent pursued. The best is yet to come. The time-saving bank not only takes care of the time you save, it pays you interest on it as well. In other words, you end up with more time than you put in. How much more? Mr. Figaro asked breathlessly. Well, that's up to you, the agent told him. It depends on how much time you save and how long you leave it on deposit with us. Leave it on deposit? I mean, how do you mean? Well, it's quite simple. If you don't withdraw the time you save for 5 years, we credit you with the same amount again. So your savings double every 5 years. Do you follow? And they're worth 4 times as much after 10 years and 8 times as much after 15. And say you started saving a mere 2 hours a day 20 years ago, by your 62nd birthday, or after 40 years in all, you'd have 256 times as much in the bank as you originally put in. And that would mean a credit balance of 26,910,720,000 seconds. And the agent produced the chalk again and wrote the figure on the mirror. 26,910,720,000. You can see for yourself, Mr. Figaro, he went on, smiling thinly for the first time. You'd have accumulated over 10 times your entire lifespan just by saving a couple hours a day for 40 years. And if that's not a paying proposition, I don't know what is. You're right, Mr. Figaro said wearily. It certainly is. What a fool I was for not saving time years ago. It didn't dawn on me till now. I would have to admit I am appalled. No need to be, said the man in gray soothingly. None at all. It's never too late to save time. You can start today if you want to. Well, of course I want to, exclaimed Mr. Figaro. What do I have to do? Well, the agent raised his eyebrows. So surely you know how to save time, dear sir. Work faster, for instance, and stick to the essentials. Spend only 15 on each customer instead of the usual half hour, and avoid time-wasting conversations. Now reduce the hour you spend with your mother by half. Better still, put her in a nice, cheap old folks home where someone else can look after her, and they'll save you a whole hour a day. And get rid of the useless budgerigar, and see Miss Daria once every 2 weeks, if at all, and give up your 15-minute review of the day's events. And above all, don't squander so much of your precious time on singing, reading, and hobnobbing with your so-called friends. And incidentally, I'd also advise you to hang a really accurate clock on the wall so that you can time your apprentice to the nearest minute. Well, fine, said Mr. Figaro. I can manage all that. But what about the time I save? I mean, do I have to pay it in? And if so, where? Should I keep it somewhere safe until you collect it? I mean, how does the system operate? The man in gray gave another thin-lipped smile. Don't worry. We take care of that. Rest assured, we don't mislay a single second of time you save. You'll find you haven't any left over. All right, Mr. Figaro said dazedly. I'll take you at your word. Well, you can do that with complete confidence, my dear sir. The agent rose to his feet. And now permit me to welcome you to the ranks of the great time-saving movement. You are a truly modern and progressive member of the community, Mr. Figaro, and I congratulate you. So saying, he picked up his hat and briefcase. One moment, said Mr. Figaro. Shouldn't there be some form of contract? I mean, oughtn't I sign something? I mean, don't I get a policy of some kind? Agent number XYQ/384/B, who had already reached for the door, turned and regarded Mr. Figaro with faint annoyance. What on earth for? He demanded. Time saving can't be compared with any kind of saving. It calls for absolute trust on both sides. Your word is good enough for us, especially as you can't go back on it, and we will take care of your savings, though how much you save is entirely up to you. We never bring pressure to bear on our customers. Good day, Mr. Figaro. And on that note, the agent climbed into his smart gray car and purred off. Mr. Figaro gazed after him, kneading his brow. Although he was gradually becoming warmer again, he felt sick and wretched. The air still reeked of smoke from the agent's cigar, a dense blue haze that was slow to disperse. Not until the smoke had finally gone did Mr. Figaro begin to feel better. But as it faded, so did the figures chalked up on the mirror, and by the time they had vanished altogether, Mr. Figaro's recollection of his visitor had vanished too. He forgot that the man in gray, but not his new resolution, which he believed to be his alone. The determination to save time now, so as to be able to begin a new life sometime in the future, had embedded itself in his soul like a poisoned arrow. And when the first customer of the day turned up, Mr. Figaro gave him a surly reception, and by doing no more than was absolutely necessary and keeping his mouth shut, he got through it in 20 minutes instead of the usual 30. And from now on, he subjected every customer to the same treatment. Although he ceased to enjoy his work, that was of secondary importance. He engaged 2 assistants in addition to his apprentice and watched them like a hawk to see that they didn't waste a moment. Every move they made was geared to a precise timetable in accordance with the notice that now adorned the wall of the barbershop. Time saved is time doubled. Mr. Figaro wrote Miss Daria a brief businesslike note, regretting that pressure of work would prevent him from seeing her in the future. His budrigar he sold to a pet shop, and as for his mother, he put her in an inexpensive old folks' home and visited her once a month. In the belief that the gray stranger's recommendations were his own decisions, he carried them out to the letter. Meanwhile, he was becoming increasingly restless and irritable. The odd thing was that no matter how much time he saved, he never had any to spare, and in some mysterious way, it simply vanished. Imperceptibly at first, but then quite unmistakably, and his days grew shorter and shorter. Almost before he knew it, another week had gone by, and another month, and another year, and another, and another, and another. And having no recollection of the gray stranger's visit, Mr. Figaro should seriously have asked himself where all his time was going. But that was a question that he never considered by him or any other time saver. Something in the nature of a blind obsession had taken a hold of him, and when he realized to his horror that his days were flying by faster and faster, as he occasionally did, it only reinforced his grim determination to save time. Many other inhabitants of the city were similarly afflicted. Every day, more and more people took to saving time, and the more they did, the more they were copied by others, even by those who had no real desire to join in but felt obliged to. Radio, television, and newspapers daily advertised and extolled the merits of the new time-saving gadgets that would one day leave people free to live the right kind of life. Walls and billboards were plastered with posters depicting scenes of happiness and prosperity, and splashed across them in fluorescent lettering were slogans such as, "Time savers are going places fast. The future belongs to time savers. Make more of your life. Save time." The real picture, however, was very different. Admittedly, time savers were better dressed than the people who lived near the old amphitheater, and they earned more money and they had more to spend, but they looked tired and disgruntled and sour, and there was an unfriendly light in their eyes. They'd never heard the phrase, "Why not go and see Momo?" Nor did they have anyone to listen to them in a way that would make them feel reasonable or conciliatory, let alone happy. Even had they known of such a person, they would have been highly unlikely to pay him or her a visit unless the whole affair could be dealt with in 5 minutes or flat, or they would have considered it a waste of time. In their view, even leisure time had to be used to the full, so as to extract the maximum of entertainment and relaxation with the minimum of delay. Whatever the occasion, whether solemn or joyous, time savers could no longer celebrate it properly. Daydreaming they regarded as a criminal offense. What could they endure least of all, however, was silence, for when silence fell, they became terrified by the realization of what was happening to their lives. And so, whenever silence threatened to descend, they made a noise. It wasn't a happy sound, of course, like the hubbub on a children's playground, but an angry, ill-tempered din that grew louder every day. It had ceased to matter that people should enjoy their work and take pride in it. On the contrary, enjoyment merely slowed them down. All that mattered was to get through as much work as possible in the shortest possible time. So notices to the effect were prominently displayed on every factory and every office building, and they read, "Time is precious, do not waste it," or "Time is money, save it." And similar notices hung above business executives' desks and in boardrooms and in doctors' consulting rooms and shops and restaurants and department stores and even in schools and kindergartens. No one was left out. And last but not least, the appearance of the city itself changed more and more. Old buildings were pulled down and replaced with modern ones, void of all the things that were now thought superfluous. No architect troubled to design houses that suited people who were to live in them, because that would have meant building a whole range of different houses, and it was far cheaper and above all more time-saving to make them identical. Huge modern housing developments sprang up on the city's northern outskirts, endless rows of multi-storied remnants as indistinguishable as peas in a pod, and because the buildings all looked alike, of course, so did the streets. They grew steadily longer, stretching way to the horizon in dead straight lines and turning the countryside into a disciplined desert. The lives of the people who had inhabited this desert followed a similar pattern. They ran dead straight as far as the eye could see. Everything in them was carefully planned and programmed down to the last move and the last moment of time. People never seemed to notice that by saving time, they were losing something else. No one cared to admit that life was becoming ever poorer, bleaker, and more monotonous. The ones who felt this most keenly were the children, because no one had time for them anymore. But time is life itself, and life resides in the human heart. And the more people saved, the less they had. All right. This next chapter is kind of long, and I'm getting a little sleepy. So I'm just going to say good night. And for people who are joining in, maybe I'll get another chapter. I'm going to be away for a few days, the early part of next week, but I will try to be more rigorous at sticking to the read alouds. And yeah, so I'm back in Philly. Seattle chewed me up and spit me out. And so now I'm back here and looking for work in Philly so I can keep my cozy house and where I can sew my quilts and read my books and tell people things. So I have from now till the spring. So wish me luck on that. If you have any leads or if you want to endorse me on LinkedIn or whatever goofy things is involved. But yeah, it feels good to be home, and it feels good to have like a cool rainy night after a couple super hot days. And yeah, it's good to see you all here, even though there's just 12 of you. So anyway, thanks. Until next time, folks. All right. Bye-bye.